take the square of fabric that's going to be used for your bias binding, and you're going to cut a diagonal line from corner to corner to divide the square into 2 triangles. Then you're going to take 2 of the opposite sides, so I always do the right and the left, and you're going to match them right sides together. So you're going to match the right side with the left side, having the fabrics right sides together, and you'll want about 1/4 of an inch overhang of the triangle edge on each end, and that will account for our seam allowance. So you're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam along this side, that we matched up both of those raw edges, and you're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam, and by having that overhang, then the edges of our fabric will line up after we press the seam open. So you'll do a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and then press your seam open. Next, you're going to open up your bias binding piece. So I've already went ahead and pressed my seam allowance open. And you're going to want to cut strips along the longer side. So here we have the shorter side, which is the straight of grain, and then our bias side is the longer edge of the triangle. So we're going to want to cut our strips going with the biased edge, and you can just kind of stretch. You'll notice there's a lot of stretch on this raw edge, and there's only just a little bit of stretch on this raw edge. So this is the bias edge here. So you can cut either 2 1/4 inch wide strips or 2 1/2 inch wide strips, and you'll cut as many as you can along the bias edge. So if you like a really nice tight binding, then cut 2 1/4. If you want to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, if you're new at bias binding, then I'd recommend doing 2 1/2 inch strips. So here I have my bias strips. Next, you're going to join each of the ends with right sides together, and the raw edges on the ends will be perpendicular to each other. So you're going to place them right sides together, and the way that I always remember how they go is I'll position them how I want my strip to look. So obviously this will need to be seamed here, and the angles will be going the same direction. And then I turn one so it's right sides together with the other. And again, you'll want about 1/4 of an inch overhang on each corner, and you're going to sew the strips together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you'll press that seam open, so you'll have joined 2 of your strips together, and then you'll repeat to join these 2 strips as well. So you'll have 1 long strip of bias binding. So once that is done, your bias binding is prepped, and you can set this aside for the moment. Once the base is attached, just feel around all the seams to make sure that you didn't miss any of the fabrics, and just go back and restitch if you missed any places around the corners especially. So now we're ready to bind the bottom edge of the train case, and that is the final step to complete our bag. So you're going to take your bias binding that we prepped earlier, and you're going to fold one of the angled edges a 1/2 inch to the wrong side and press, and I'm just going to finger press it. And then take a scissors and trim that tail corner even with the side edge of the bias binding. Then you're going to fold the bias binding in half lengthwise and match those raw edges. And if you'd like, you can take this over to your iron and press the entire strap so the fold stays flat. Or you can take some pins and pin the bias binding so the fold stays in place. So I'm just going to clip mine to the train case bottom. So you're going to place the bias binding against the lining side of the train case panel. So I would start on either the front or the back long edges. You don't want to start on a corner or one of the shorter edges. And you can use some sewing clips to hold this in place. And you're going to start sewing about 4 inches from this top tail end. So 4 inches in, and this is where you'll start sewing. And you're going to attach the bias binding with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. And then once we get closer to the beginning end, you're going to stop sewing and you'll trim the tail end of the binding so it tucks inside the beginning end, and you'll want to trim it just before where you started sewing. And you'll tuck that in, and then you can continue sewing to join the pieces of binding. And I'll show you how to do that. So first we're going to start by sewing 1/4 inch. So all the way around, and then stop sewing about 1 inch or 2 from the beginning tail end of the bias binding. I stopped sewing about 2 inches from the beginning end of the binding, and now I'm just going to fold the binding down and take my scissors, and I'm going to trim about 1 inch beyond that lower folded edge of the beginning end. And then I'm going to tuck that tail end of the binding inside the beginning end. And actually, even before I do that, I'm going to put a pin in the beginning end so it doesn't shift, because when you go to sew, you might push this beginning end out of the way, so we want to make sure it stays in place. So I'm just going to add a pin. Now I'm going to tuck that tail end inside so the folds are flush and so are the raw edges. And then I'm just going to clip it in place. And then take this back over to the sewing machine and pick up where we left off and sew with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure to backstitch and then continue sewing the remaining piece of the binding. So once that is done, then you can fold the binding over to the opposite side, and then you're going to top stitch this folded edge down. So just make sure that your bag is out of the way and you're only sewing the binding down, and you'll go around the corners, and just make sure that your train case is tucked out of the way. You wouldn't want it to be flipped up, so make sure it's pressed down, and you'll fold all the binding over and top stitch 1/8 inch from that folded edge. Here's what the train case bottom will look like with the binding attached. So once you have that completely bound, you can turn it right side out